this is potentially the way that we might want to think about it, is like, not AI is going to replace me completely, even if we hope it would, so that we could just do whatever we want. But actually, could it help us augment the stuff that we enjoy doing, maybe automate the stuff that we don't like doing? But also, for example, like what we're working on with NeuroCreate is like, can it actually really help us be more creative, help us get even more into our humanness, train us even more in the way that our brain thinks and likes to think, and get really optimum.
We are Humble Mind, a learning community with an insatiable curiosity for bold ideas, deep conversations, and the connections that matter in both life and business. This podcast is where we get to speak with other humble minds. And if you're a member of our community, you get to join our recording live today, like Matt and Rana are here with us live. And you get access to early recordings of our podcast, various different sessions of clips on our platform, our weekly newsletter, content replays, our community courses, as well as an invitation to our live group meetups. So check out join.humblemind.co for more. Now, imagine a world where the latest advancements in neuroscience combined with all of the crazy, scary, but also exciting hype and technology of artificial intelligence can come together and get a chance to ignite your creativity and evaluate and elevate, rather, what you do to new heights. Is that even possible? Would it even be possible to learn more about how the brain works, never mind artificial brains? And what if you could tap into the secrets of how all of these incredible natural systems, how they work and how to unlock your full potential? Well, today we're going to be diving into this captivating topic with Dr. Shama Rahman. So we'll be exploring some of the current insights that she's busy playing with right now in neuroscience. We're going to be talking about human creativity, how that works, how well we understand it. We're also going to be speaking about the transformative power of flow state. What exactly is that? How does it work? We're going to be speaking about a range of different things. And I'm really excited to have Dr. Shama Rahman with us, who is a neuroscientist. She's an entrepreneur. She's a musician, an artist, and the founder of neurocreate.co.uk. So welcome, Dr. Shama. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Fabulous. Yeah, great to have you with us as well. So maybe just for context, because I probably can't do it anyway as well as you can, in terms of what has led you to where you are currently on this route. As a little bit of research after we first spoke, didn't know how much of a great musician and artist you are, but now I do know. Now I'm glad. And then you've also gone in this wonderful direction of becoming a researcher, and really embroiled yourself into the world of neuroscience and jumping into the realm of creativity and understanding and trying to unlock human creativity. What was that path like? Give us a quick snapshot of what happened along that incredibly adventurous journey that you must have taken.
Yeah, I think I must have started tapping into my musical side since I was a baby. I mean, I was told that I was incessantly humming all the time. So it's one of those things that I think, you just come into the world singing. That'd be lovely to hear. But I think, in my schooling, I also got very sort of drawn to biology, because I was very interested in observing nature. I was drawing it all the time, and somehow, I ended up catching the science teacher's eye, and from there on, kind of shunted into the kind of science route, thinking that was a space that potentially I'd excel at. Secretly, I always wanted to be a concert pianist, and so continued sneaking out of my classes and essentially just playing along.
Wow.
But nowhere in any of my, let's say, mentoring or advice or parenting or, teachers all included, did I ever know that I could have also followed the artist path, or that there could have been, a conservatoire or, maybe theater school or whatever it was. I just knew that, you go to university to go and do the hard sciences, or, go and study law or become a doctor like my dad. That kind of thing. So in the end, I just ended up doing both.
Why not?
And
Life is short.
so, yeah, right. Yeah, and I guess at one point I kind of, stopped at a train track at some point and just went, do you know what? This music thing is just not going away. I've got to do something about it. And then, I was kind of at that kind of, let's say, when you go in the sort of scientific career, and I see we have a PhD amongst us, you kind of go, do we, well, even in academia in general, let's say, do we go along that kind of route, or do we go into industry, or do we go into practice, or whatever it is, right? And I was like, well, I just don't want to choose between science and art. And I thought, well, actually, what if I brought that together? And I just did, and I proposed that as my PhD sort of subject. And I was like, okay, I want to do the neuroscience of creativity, and I want to do it specifically within music. And I went and sort of proposed it to a few different spaces, and they both said yes. And thus was born this kind of interdisciplinary craziness, where on one hand I was in the physics department, complex mathematics system at Imperial, and on the other hand, there was Goldsmiths. These are both in London, by the way, for our American counterparts here, where I could do crazy things like, detecting brain activity of musicians, and actually recruit them in the first place. And then there was the Royal College of Music itself, and various other conservatoires in jazz, for example, within London, where I could tap into for some advice. So yeah, somehow that all kind of converged for the first time at that point.
Wow. Incredible. Wow. What a journey. Certainly couldn't make that up. Um, and so I'm sure, over the course of your career, and certainly what you're doing now with NeuroCreate, it's led you to ponder on some big questions and some big areas. And I'd love to kind of dig into that a little bit and to sort of see what is the common practice, or what is the common thinking when it comes to thinking about a massive concept like creativity. Maybe we can start there. Is there sort of an accepted or a decent definition of what creativity even is? How can we define it?
Yeah. I love you asking, is there a decent definition of it? First off, I don't think creativity is one thing. I think it's a toolbox. Secondly, there are different processes. And thirdly, there are different stages to those processes. But, an academic way of potentially looking at it is like, it's something unexpected or novel, something that potentially maybe sort of elicits an aesthetic response. Maybe that's emotional, maybe that's visual, whatever that is. And then potentially something that's useful, which is kind of interesting, where you're like, okay, what is useful about a painting? Let's ponder, right? And I think there's a huge array of what useful means there, in terms of value and what that kind of gives us, both sort of emotionally, inspirationally, etc. But that's the academic, let's say,
Yes.
and then you can so delve into it and go into deeper kind of areas. So the kinds of things I was looking at, was looking at everything from like the philosophical thoughts of mind that have been proposed, to sort of more interview-based, practice-based, phenomenological ways of looking at it, to creative cognition psychology models, and going, wow, there's such a lot out there. And my question essentially was, is there one ring that binds it all? In a sense. So, being a neuroscientist, I was obviously like, physiology, it must be that way. There's something there, but it was super, super exploratory. And that's why I was in the complex systems space. I really like that. Instead of being like, okay, I have a hypothesis and I'm either going to prove this right or wrong, it was much more like, let's see, let's observe, let's figure that out, kind of thing. And because of that, just like any creative process, if you've ever been in one, it's very murky and you wade through, and then finally maybe you kind of hold up a nugget at the end. I looked at, for example, even with the music, right, you have different sort of ways of approaching, say, classical music, or say jazz music, and whether you're performing it or whether you're composing it, or whether you're thinking about it or you're actually performing, right? So it was all about essentially creating experiments that were also ecologically valid, aka true to form and practice, and then going, let the creativity flourish, and then let's see, if there's any signature brain pattern. And that's pretty much what ended up happening. And I ended up finding a signature brain pattern for when performers were objectively rated to be creative. So I kind of did a bypassing there. Essentially, we asked people themselves how creative they thought they had been just after performing something, and then we also objectively gave it out to other sort of performers, people from conservatoires who are what's the word, well versed in assessing, let's say.
Right.
So within the kind of professional and academic realms. And all of this was all double blind. And it turns out that the objective assessments consistently mapped to a signature brain pattern of the performers, not necessarily the self-assessments, which is quite interesting as well, which I can get into in a bit. But all I asked them was exactly the same question, said, dig deep, gut feeling, 7 seconds, go. And somehow they converged, right, into an answer. And a lot of the things about creativity assessment, looks at other things like, the openness with which something was delivered, or, the style of communication, or confidence, or whatever it is, right, versus the actual thing itself. And so, yeah, that was a bypass. It was like, right, just how creative was that? And so it turns out, so when people are within that kind of creative zone, that performance, they're coming up with highly creative performances, there is a correlation with their brain activity. And that's the flow state.
Is there, I want to get into the flow state in a moment, but just to linger on what you said there, there's a correlation. What kind of correlation? Are there certain areas in the brain that kind of, light up more than others, and that corresponds, that ends after that creative sort of period is ended? Like what were those correlations?
Yeah. So I was in the complex systems department because I thought actually the whole brain would be involved in some way. And through mathematics, we'd be able to see, the variations of how, let's say. Yeah. What I was really surprised to find that there were actually areas, not the whole brain, but a few areas, several parts that actually did, as you say, light up or actually not light up. And it turns out that one of these areas, which is located roughly here, for those of us who can't see that was essentially the left medial prefrontal cortex. Bit of a mouthful, essentially. But interestingly, it acts like a hub for the rest of the brain and for lots of different networks in the brain. Wow. So it integrates, things like decision making, emotions, motor cortex, even memory, all those kinds of things, but it does it in a way that sits just below our conscious attention. So there you get to that sense of feeling like it's flow because it's rather fast in the way that it, experientially feels, if that makes sense. So that's the major part that seems to be the biggest kind of contribution to the signature. But there are other parts also. So, for example, there's this bit right here. It's the right precuneus that seems to get involved. And curiously, that is also involved when people are under anesthesia, and also when people are in that hypnagogic state. So that's essentially that time between sleep and wake, for example.
Yeah. Does that have anything to do with theta waves?
Yeah, there can be. So hypnagogic states definitely have this association with theta because it's one of the kind of states of arousal.
Yes.
And theta, alpha, beta, gamma, all of that comes from sort of arousal studies from a little while ago looking at sleep. And so, theta is often associated between sleep and wake. But I'll get to that in a second. But also these areas here, which are the dorsolateral areas on the sides of your brain, they kind of get involved as well. But these parts are related to things like time awareness, also your self-consciousness, that kind of thing. And curiously, at least what my research showed, that they kind of depress. Which all kind of makes sense when it comes to the experience of when you're in that flow state, because you kind of lose track of time. You're not particularly self-critical.
Yes.
You're able, I think with that hypnagogic bit, right, you're able to have quite a distributed attention versus then you've got this bit here, which is like this hub controller. And it's much more kind of precise and looking at all the like sort of details and things, but it's doing it really fast. But then essentially with AI, essentially a kind of AI called machine learning, in our case, we're looking at deep learning. It's able to detect very complex patterns. So although I was kind of disappointed that the whole brain wasn't involved in some way, turns out, the patterns is more complex than alpha, beta, theta in terms of the kinds of frequency bands that are showing up, because it's not just alpha or beta or theta, but deep learning algorithms essentially can detect very accurately when you are in that flow state or not.
Wow, incredible. Before we move on to AI, while we're still talking about creativity and specifically in the field of music, I remember reading a book, I'm sure you know, by Daniel Levitin a couple of years ago. This is Your Brain on Music. And I'm a musician too. And so it was obviously wonderful to read about how all of these, kind of idols of mine think and how they react and how their brains potentially work when they're creative and when they're in that state. And I remember him saying something about how memory plays a very important part in kind of imprinting something. I think the word he even used was imprinting, there's a sort of a fingerprint of these neurons that wire together, that fire together. And that's also why we're able to remember songs that maybe I heard 30 years ago. I can't even remember what I told you, what I had for breakfast yesterday, but I can tell you that song and I can even sing it. I know the melody, So it's incredible how the brain has this ability to recall, but ability to kind of, we can tell when it's in a creative state. Doesn't really matter what the creative state is producing, because often I think that's the problem in a way with trying to measure and understand creativity, right? We assess it by the output, by what it's being creative, what has it done as a result of that creativity. But at the same time, it is still a brain state, right? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
I think you're saying like there's a difference between the process and the output, and maybe it's good to also, really celebrate the process. And I'm a full believer in something like that, because I think, well, one of the cool things about flow state is that it's intrinsically motivating. No one's telling you to get into flow. Go on, let's go. It's more like, no, I really want to be in it, right? And that's the whole point, because it's so enjoyable, and the sheer joy of creativity. And yes, it is also very frustrating, but at the end of the day, we end up doing these creative processes because of all the sort of rewarding multiple rewarding kind of milestones, I guess, that we hit. It's frustrating though, but we still persevere because of how we feel. And I think the process is super important in this whole thing. And it's kind of interesting that you're bringing in memory as well. There's so many things to say about memory, because turns out music is really good for your memory in general. You can actually
as a way to sort of keep the muscle flexed.
Couple of things actually. So you can actually increase your working memory by essentially trying to remember some melodies. The longer the melody, the better. There you go. So something that I can definitely attest to, like the way that I learned sitar is actually through auditory rather than through scores or anything like that. So, my teacher would play and then I would learn, and on a Saturday morning after having gone out the night before, this was a really good way of like essentially training my mind. And, and there I was feeling like death, but feeling like amazing, because, there were like 1 minute melodies that I could, by the end of it, do. Whereas before it started with something like 15 seconds. And so, you have to keep it up. I don't think I can do that
good
anymore,
for the hand-eye coordination as well. It's a whole physical experience too, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh yeah. So there's definitely lots of studies on that, especially when you're a kid, right? So when you're about 2 or so, that is when you have like the most number of neuronal connections. And that older does, unless you use it, you lose it. That definitely starts happen, and you start pruning. And so it's a good thing to start to introduce musical instruments if possible, at that age, because some of the things that retain are those kind of connections, especially also hemispherically, in terms of like the corpus callosum, which kind of links the two. which obviously is really good for like information processing and all kinds of things like that. And you'll see that there's a lot of conductors that live to quite an old age, fully corpus mentis as well.
Yes.
So I think there's quite a lot of interesting things about that. And if you look at some sort of interesting things about Alzheimer's or dementia, there's some really heartbreaking sort of let's say case studies where there are people who seem to have completely lost who they are or their memories or anything like that. Even the ability to speak, but then as soon as you play some of their old favorites, or at least things they
Right.
know, let's
Immediately,
say,
it's a
or
recall. Yeah.
yeah, but
It's
not only
incredible.
do you can see their eyes kind of light up as if they're back in, right?
Yeah.
But not only that, they'll get up and start moving, and
Yeah.
not only that, they'll actually start talking, right?
Yeah.
And they'll be able to access parts of their memory, which isn't necessarily related to the music. It might be, finally recognizing who that person next to you is, for example,
Incredible.
just for
Yeah.
that moment and
It's like
talking.
watering a garden. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So it turns out there's parts of the memory that is not affected by sort of progressive illnesses like Alzheimer's and dementia that's
Yeah.
somehow preserved. So yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
music's good.
Yeah. Music is good. Absolutely. So just before we move away from creativity, even though we could probably dedicate a few podcast episodes to just understanding it, but I find it so interesting that we have neuroscience as this incredible tool that can tell us what is going on in the brain, or at least it tells us that something is going on in the brain, right? There's still so many mysteries about how it works, how it's wired together, why it's wired together like that. And I have no doubt in the coming decades we'll just keep on learning more and more and more. But at the same time, though, we are trying to extrapolate understanding about something that often happens at a qualitative level, within the brain. We don't
Mm,
know how these things, right down to the end point, how they're kind of coming out, whether you're composing an opera or painting a painting, whatever the creativity yields. And we're using sort of quantitative tools to try and measure it. So obviously there is some kind of gap that we're not able to fill yet. So with that in mind, are there any sort of statements or anything that we know for sure about creativity, whether it's about where it comes from, about maybe a certain history about why it's there. Perhaps it was something that helped us to select better mates. Back when we were still trying to get away from predators, early humans. I mean, it clearly plays an evolutionary role in some way as well. So it's good
yeah,
to just understand, like,
yeah,
what can we sort of deduct or know for certain about what is creativity, where does it come from, why it's there.
yeah. I mean, there's several things you've touched on here. Whether it helps us finding a mate, I'm not sure, but definitely it helps us survive
Yes.
to the next day in order to find a
Yeah.
mate, probably. So I think creativity is I think broader than most people give it
Right.
attribute. So what I mean by that, problem solving is creativity, right? and
Yes.
and there's certain areas of, say, creative cognition that say everyday problem solving could be creativity with a little c, and then you've got incredible creative talent like Alexander McQueen with a capital C, right? They're both creativity though, right? That's one way of breaking it down, but I wouldn't even do that. It's just that I would break it down to the cognitive mechanisms and also link that with the techniques potentially that
Yeah.
we all actually know, whether we know it explicitly or not. But essentially finding a different way to do something, um, problem solving, to find a
Yes.
different outcome. Okay, that's novelty as an output. Doing something in a way that feels different or new. That's
Mm.
again a feeling, right? And so I think all of these things, probably, yeah, help us survive, right?
Yeah.
And that gives us also a variation of different survival techniques
Mm.
potentially, or just diverse ideas. I mean, we definitely know that from evolutionary theory that diversity is obviously the thing that helps us continue in case there's like some illness and we're all the same monoculture, off we go. And similarly, if that kind of diversity is rewarded when it comes to genetics, why
Right.
not when it comes to, well, okay, how do I build my house, right, or whatever that is, or how do I, go and get, that piece of food that, only I seem to have known how to get, but I can bring it back to everybody.
Yes.
Whereas if everybody had the same ideas, potentially that becomes quite stuck, and then that's it, right? In a sense, so you can kind of see it from that maybe necessary evolutionary
Yeah.
perspective, but then there's the whole like, as you know, being a musician as well, and artists out there, and anybody who's even working in strategy, right? I'm saying even just because
Yeah.
maybe you don't necessarily put the two together. I think quite similar actually.
Yeah.
These are thinking conceptual kind of spaces. Anybody working in product innovation, for example, right? Anybody working as a researcher, there's that kind of incredible thrill.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
Is that the right way of putting it? And so there's excitement, there's joy. Obviously, you mentioned that a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think we might actually be predisposed towards wanting those kinds of experiences as well, right?
Interesting.
Rather than getting, what's the word, into routine that very quickly bores us,
Yes. Yeah.
which is kind of interesting as well. But whether there's a definitive why creativity is here, I'm sure jury is out
Yeah.
on something like that. But whether it exists, I don't think the jury is out on that one.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And yeah, I know that's what I do on this podcast. I like to throw out impossibly massive questions and just sort of marvel at them. But yeah, absolutely. I find it interesting also to apply creativity and and perhaps even imagination as well, which, and I'm sure there's a definition for that as well, but whatever you might imagine, because I remember reading that the nervous system and the kind of the intelligence of the brain and the body doesn't always understand the difference between an imagined
Yeah.
situation and what is actually happening in reality, right? And so that
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
I know that there's a lot of research there and a lot of literature on that as well, which is fascinating because for us
Yeah.
it's kind of obvious. You're either asleep or awake. What's the big deal, right? We can understand consciousness, but do we really? And what is underneath all of that? So that's really important. But maybe just to switch over to kind of how we understand, in many ways we understand a lot about how the human brain works, even though there's still continuing, things that we're unlocking. But if we look at how a large language model works, because that is also effectively a brain, a collection of, hundreds of billions of neurons on its own, which is also guided, by math and computing power. Is there a sort of an idiot's guide that you can kind of quickly take us through about the differences and similarities between how a human brain works and how, let's say, a large language model works in the way that everyone knows a chat GPT model?
Yeah. 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 Although I'm sure there's going to be a lot of AI scientists who are going to completely disagree with me by now. But
It's okay. You have the mic.
originally, originally, there was a lot of crossover of theories and ideas between the two fields, between like neuroscience and AI, and like early ideas of and artificial intelligence was very much drawing inspiration from the way that the brain was perceived to be working, in addition to the central nervous system, also to the peripheral nervous system, aka our fingers and limbs and things like that as well. So the whole kind of system, to the point as well the other way around, where like actually people were referring to brains like computers, which I take umbrage at because our brains do not work like computers,
Mm,
point blank. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later if you're interested. However, the idea was, it very much was a statistical, and still is a statistical inference kind of thing when it comes to artificial intelligence. But one that a lot of people talk about are something called neural networks,
yeah.
right? And neural networks were taking inspiration originally from neuronal networks, aka the ones in the brain. And so I think just a little kind of basic fundamentals. Our brain has lots and lots of different kinds of cells in it. These are the basic kind of structures within the brain. And one of these structures is a nerve cell, aka what we talk of as neurons. And the way that nerves actually communicate with each other are through a variety of different ways. some of which are through these other kinds of cells, actually called glial cells, because they help nourish the nerves and also, essentially help them propagate their messages. And I just said propagate, so that gives you an example of the first kind of communication that nerves do. They do it via electricity. So believe it or not, we're whizzing away under this skull of ours, like full of electricity that can essentially be picked up. There's so much electricity that it can be picked up by, bog standard like sensors, essentially. I say bog standard, but there are consumer level, prosumer level wearables out there that can literally pick up all that activity that's happening. And the activity that's happening, so electricity is one of the main ways. Another way is through chemicals. So electricity is very fast, and this is how the glial cells end up helping neurons essentially propagate that message very fast, because they provide insulation. So if you think about a wire and a live wire with absolutely no insulation, A, it's dangerous and it's going everywhere, right? B, it's dissipating, right? So it's not actually going from A to B necessarily, but with that insulation, you're able to take it from A to B and very fast. And so these kind of myelin sheaths, as they're called, they're like fats that go around the nerves, and they essentially enable the let's say the communication to jump from node to node very quickly, like that. So I just mentioned nodes, right? So these are ways of essentially going from one milestone to another, and taking that information from one space to another. And this starts giving you an idea of layers of nodes, right? And this is where you have layers of neural networks. Let me not get confused. Essentially, the inspiration here for AI, right? You have essentially layers of neural networks or nodes. And then what they've done essentially is stacked many, 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 many layers. And this is where it starts getting a little lost as to how an input that was put in actually gives out a certain output, in the sense that it's quite hard to track what ends up happening in between, because there's so many layers essentially. And this is where it's given that term black box, essentially, right? Whereas, say, early machine learning, there's been, and even now, right, there's loads and loads of different ways. Machine learning essentially is pattern detections, and you can essentially use lots of different kinds of statistics, some of which are as simple as drawing a line of best fit through something, and then going what falls on either side. That's a linear regression. Some of which are, what's the word, nearest neighbors. Okay, so that clusters together. Great, that's a pattern, right? Lots of different things. Now, neuronal networks are not so easy to interpret, therefore, from that kind of mathematical side. So there's that kind of explainability issue that's kind of gone into it. But they're in, maybe people might say the similarities might stop by now, but there was your kind of inspiration of having many layers of neurons or neuronal, therefore, forming a neural network, which is similar to a neuronal network. Does that make sense so far? So where am I now?
So there's the neural network that happens in the brain, all of the different neurons.
The neuronal network. Yeah, so the neuronal network is in the brain.
Okay.
And I'm making that distinction, because it's neurons.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, and that sort of fires together, and those sort of, that elaborate web of trillions of different types of connections essentially is what helps us to see these outputs, whether I'm thinking or I'm walking or controlling whatever the brain's ultimate activity is, right? Even though there's that black box part in there where we can see who's in the house, but we don't know what they're doing.
So in say the way that neuroscientific studies might therefore pick up all of that kind of activity at the scalp when it comes to sort of like, electricity, essentially, is to then try and figure out patterns of the output that might then infer certain mental states, right? And then you've got neural networks, which are essentially a black box of a different kind, again, because it's got so many layers, you're not entirely sure how the output came about, and you're not necessarily entirely sure about the process of how the
Yes.
information passes from layer to layer and the nodes essentially. Um, but when you come to language models, it started off with small kind of word-based associations, then it
Yes.
went into like phrases, and then it went into sentences and then paragraphs, and now much more bigger kind of context windows, like some of
Yes.
the recent, outcomes. It's still pattern detection.
Mm.
Um, but just a bigger kind of window of being able to detect that pattern in a similar way to, the fact that we can kind of read a 300-page book and be like, oh yeah, on page 2 it said da da da. Well, hopefully we can still do that. It
Yeah.
depends where our brains are by now, and then we've got these really large language models being able to go, okay, cool, give me your 5-page CV and I'll turn it into a
Yeah.
2-page one or something
Yeah.
like that, right? However, it's still the reason I keep saying it's still pattern detection is that it brings it back to that consciousness idea, in the sense that sometimes what it comes out with sounds plausible, but is a complete hallucination,
Yes.
right? Because there isn't necessarily a link to a reference point or something like that. It just
Yeah.
there's a term called a stochastic parrot. In a sense, it's non-linear. It's not necessarily um, going to be the same every single time, right? Hence the
Yes.
stochastism, let's say, and parrot because it's kind of regurgitating what it's been fed, right? So
Yeah.
is there really an understanding? And I'm doing this in
Exactly. Yeah.
quotation marks for
Yeah.
those who are listening. So therefore, it might give out something that sounds plausible or amazing, and then you're
But
like,
it
hold on a
doesn't.
second, let me
Yeah.
just read that sentence again. That doesn't
Yeah.
even make sense,
Yeah. Yeah.
or at the best, and that's wrong at the worst, right? And then
Yes.
so one way that people are thinking about are like, well, what if I just retrain it with all the really factual things up until yesterday or something
Yeah.
like that? Would that make it more factual? Yeah, in as much as if as humans we say that anything that we say is factual, we can't necessarily link it to the kind
Yes.
of the references, right? But again, does it really infer understanding and consciousness? I don't think so.
Well, what's fascinating about this is that they're, both a human brain and large language model. You can argue it is a brain of some kind. There's a computation going on at some different level, even though they're totally different. Obviously, the equipment is different. But I'm reminded of something that a hero of mine, Richard Feynman, I remember watching a video of his, and he was saying, if you look at kind of what a machine brain and what a human brain can do, they really are able to, kind of resemble each other as the output. They can both write poetry, for example. They can both tell you what the capital of France is, but the way that that process happens is totally different. So for example, he was saying, well, you try and remember a couple of numbers, in sequence in the order that he gives you in, and you're really bad at doing that. Human brains can't really retain a whole lot of information, especially if it's given in a certain, we just don't remember. Whereas a machine, you can give it 50 million numbers, it'll remember each one perfectly in sequence, no problem. But if I'm, he said something like, if I'm walking down the road and someone kind of flicks their hair in a certain way and there's a sort of a light shining, I know for sure that that's Jack, right? There's a pattern recognition there immediately that I don't need any more information because I know I'm right. That's absolutely Jack, no problem. Whereas a machine, or at least in this way, the pattern recognition process would take so much longer, require so much more energy. And it might not even know it. It might not even make it, it might not even make the right sort of prediction there. And I suppose that's the difference there between some sort of output that's a prediction versus an intelligence or a conscious understanding of something that is in front of you. And so it's so interesting just to see the different ways that we can understand how intelligence exists, because clearly it's an intelligence, there's an intelligence going on, but it's just so different to ours. And I think where we mistake that sometimes is in the output, is in the, but it's talking to me as if it's a real person. It's written this poem. I can feel, wow, I felt, it really, wow, well done, ChatGPT. You really, made me feel something there. But that's just a pattern, right?
Yeah, and I mean, you've hit two nails on the head there, I think. One is like the sequence of processing, and I don't think we're particularly linear. Although, yeah, like I said, if you do some music, maybe you are able to
Right.
regurgitate 50 in a row. But, that's why we might need things like memory palaces as techniques and things like that. We're very good at associations with other senses as well. And so that's the second thing, which is that we're very multimodal.
Yes.
I should say multisensory, because multimodal comes from the AI side of things. But essentially, like you said, flick of the hair, a scent of, his perfume or whatever it
Yeah.
is, and that's Jack, right? Why? Because essentially we've been evolved to have this multisensory integration. And a lot of the media that we have around us is very unisensory. Like we're doing
Yes.
one right now, right? It's very 2D in a sense, but we're spatial creatures, right? And so
Mm.
there's a lot of things there that actually maybe put together is actually what makes us and allows us to be very fast in certain ways. But in certain ways, therefore, like you said, if it's sequential, it kind of throws us because it doesn't have all of those other things. We need all of those other things, in order
Yes.
to get to our conclusion. And the other thing is like a lot of biology is actually driven by quantum processes, and that's another physics thing to throw in the
Right.
spanner there. And it's not um, it's much faster as well than current computation. Not to say quantum isn't on its way; it is. It's around the corner. Um, yeah. So once those two things come together, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Fascinating to say the least. Is there, and I want to get onto what NeuroCreate, your business, does in a moment as well, because
Yeah.
it's I'm fascinated by that. But um, we're also in an era now where we're not only learning so much about what artificial intelligence can teach us, can help us to do, can augment our lives, all of these things, but we're also kind of in a space where, as human beings, we're kind of needing to almost reassess and reevaluate what our contributions will be. If we don't need to be number crunching so hard anymore, great, get an app to do that. Get AI to do that, no problem. All right, now what am I going to do? I've got all this free time on my hands. How can I then put myself to work or to good use in a different way? Obviously, there's various different examples. So, I mean, is there a sort of a neuroscience backed consensus, or perhaps within some of your own research as well, that sort of talks to the importance of soft skills, of the skills of
Hmm.
problem solving, connection, debating, listening, asking questions, creativity, these kinds of things, which, and even I hate that term, soft skills. I prefer to call it
I was
human.
just about to say they're not soft skills.
Yeah, they're not soft at all. Absolutely. So, because clearly we're needing to move more into that area. I think that's, if anything, what AI and the story that we've seen unfold over the last 2 years. If we're going to continue to own our own little bit of territory as human beings, as when the killer robots come, even though Dave Burst doesn't think that they're coming, that's all overrated. So I'm glad I can sleep well at night. Anyway, but but the point is that, like, what is there a good case that we can make for being able to sort of double down on the things that are innately human?
So a lot of my own work looks at the health benefits of creativity in and of itself. Um, and yeah, there's just been so much work that actually shows the link between creativity, flow states, cognitive flexibility, stress resilience, all these kinds of things that actually take it away from the realm of soft skills completely,
Hmm.
in the sense that it's absolutely, I would say, imperative to healthy aging, to our sort of everyday daily mental health and cognitive health. There's also been other research that's been done more from the kind of economic side of things, where they've shown that improving cognitive skills can actually lead to sort of greater sort of GDP per capita. I think that's the way of phrasing it. But also that creativity actually leads to resilience organizationally. So, that's super important. And actually, there's been studies recently which have shown that as AI and automation continues, creativity is going to be a skill that's going to be one of the top highest sort of things that people can possess. That amongst with collaboration, and innovation in general. So, people like the World Economic Forum have kind of identified that as top 3 skills. Deloitte did that piece of research on resilience. Nesta, who are the National Endowment for Science, Technology and Arts here in the UK, looked at this kind of creativity as a future skills workforce kind of thing. And my own work is looking at this kind of the link between how we can utilize creativity as a mechanism to get into the flow states, and other people that have shown how like flow states really help with like stress resilience. The other things are, there's been some fascinating work that's been coming out of America as well, where actually it's shown that innovation training, simple pen and paper based innovation training, let alone digital or whatever AI assisted, actually improves blood-brain barrier, sort of blood flow, if that makes sense. So you're actually increasing the blood flow to your brain. They found that it increased it by 8%, which is equivalent to reversing your brain age by decades. So I think if we start thinking about the way that our relationship to work is and completely changing that, because we're still kind of in that space of the industrial revolution that just went past, right? We come in, we clock into work, we have a weekend, right? And a lot of that is in service to factory assembly line, in service to machines. And actually, it's the other way around now, maybe, hopefully, right? And this is potentially the way that we might want to think about it, is like, not AI is going to replace me completely, even if we hope it would, so that we could just do whatever we want. But actually, could it help us augment the stuff that we enjoy doing, maybe automate the stuff that we don't like doing? But also, for example, like what we're working on with NeuroCreate is like, can it actually really help us be more creative, help us get even more into our humanness, train us even more in the way that our brain thinks and likes to think and get really optimum, rather than thinking about it as, oh, now I've got too much time, I can rest on our laurels. We start then thinking, well, what is the real meaning of life? Is to actually, drill down on health and the ability to think clearly and, communicate and collaborate and have our kind of relationships with each other and build great things in the world, right?
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. I agree. And so maybe just before we get to Rana, who's posed a great question there, you can tell us a bit more about how you're realizing this within NeuroCreate, your business, because that's quite a task you've set for yourself. And I have no doubt you're going to make waves. But I'm just curious as to how you're doing that, how you're delivering that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the big vision is to enable people to get into flow states. And then it's like, well, how? There are as many routes into flow as there are activities in the world, which is like 1,000,001, right? And so you can get into flow running, you can get into flow playing the violin, you can get into flow like swimming. And I thought, well, okay, what about utilizing creativity itself as a mechanism? And so I kind of alluded to that a second ago, but essentially creativity has a lot of cognitive mechanisms, and that's things like, how can we improve cognitive flexibility? How can we help improve your ability to see different perspectives? How can we improve your ability to research around a topic and see patterns? How can we improve your ability to come up with lots of divergent ideas and lots of sort of diverse ideas, but also being able to see those kind of patterns from a bird's eye view, and then essentially having your aha moments. And how can we do this in a way that feels seamless as well? So how can we actually design that interaction? So that's all the thinking that's gone behind it. Now, what are the actual products? But essentially, I was like, well, people are audio visual, cognitive. Remember, I was talking about this kind of multisensory integration. And so we've developed this kind of way of thinking about a platform, which is called the Flow Create platform. And there's multiple co-pilots that we're building, essentially. Some people are going to be more visual, some people are going to be more auditory, and some people are going to be, more cognitive. And so the very first product that's out there is the cognitive one. And so it's an innovation tool. It's an ideation and innovation tool. And it takes you all the way from having a fuzzy idea in order to be able to brainstorm it, find the patterns, and essentially have an output, where you'll have a pitch deck with all of your conceptual territories, all of your strategies, all of your design assets,
wow.
your stories, everything in a way that you can then go and implement it. So then you can use other tools like, Photoshop or whatever. But essentially, my aim is to help you in the upstream thinking part and get from that fuzzy idea into something actionable and
Wow.
Filled with insight. So that's
yeah, that's an area of need if I've ever heard one, because often just for me in my own process of thinking and building a business and everything that I do in a day, I can, it's easy for me to have a million ideas, but being able to kind of have a system that can kind of help me to capture some of that, which not only just I can, put it into a Word doc, but not just that, but to help me to continue to work on it and to refine it and to transform it into something that, oh, this actually now is an entity and I can use it and I can continue to work on it and I can share it with others. That is a co-pilot. That's more than a co-pilot. That's what a co-pilot should really be, rather than just a repository where I just copy and paste text. It's a big difference.
Yeah,
so that's
absolutely.
awesome.
Yeah, so entrepreneurs for sure. Obviously, I was thinking of myself and yourself and various people who've gone down this route. But those who work in innovation, design thinking, creatives, people who work in strategy, games, all kinds of things. Anybody who works in the space of ideas and would like to see it manifested in some way. And it's really easy to just log onto this, like we've done a web-based thing, and people can collaborate together, have teams, work hybrids, all kinds of things like that. And so that's making a little soft launch now. So if you guys are interested, I can give you a little access to it.
Wonderful.
And yeah. Apart from that, there's other things in the works when it comes to the visual side and the audio side. So to be watched. Is that the right word of putting it?
Yeah, to be to be followed for sure. Yeah, wonderful. That's awesome. That's really, really exciting. I want to come to Rana quickly, who had a great question. Rana, it's such a great question. I want to hear it in your own words, unabridged.
I have two questions, but I'm gonna go with that last question. What is the relationship between creativity and critical thinking, which I was in up till last year? I was in academia and I was an educator of mathematics, and seeing the decline in critical thinking and the exacerbation of that decline by the digital distractions that we're being presented with. So if you could speak about that relationship between creativity and critical thinking.
Absolutely. Very, very big question, actually. First of all, I don't think that the two are opposed to each other. We actually utilize analytical and critical thinking within the creative process. So I kind of alluded to it a little bit where, there is that phase where it's actually encouraged not to have that critical, let's say, critic or self-critic on your shoulder. And that would be the ideation part, essentially, where you're having a lot of different possibilities, for example, where there isn't necessarily one right answer like there is in mathematics currently, right? But you might want to just explore the entire possibility space, for example. But once you've done that, your critical thinking very much needs to be brought into it in terms of analyzing what's feasible, actually kind of testing out certain routes and all the rest of it. And again, when we come to creativity, it's a very broad term, right? And so when we're thinking about innovation and when we're thinking about innovation, let's say in product or in engineering or in physics or, any other kind of research space as well, has to be mired in fact. And so, there is not really that separation between being able to think fluidly while still having, that ability to hone in on, what's a physical law, for example, or what is known about this and this chemical, substrate, or, what is the kind of mathematical formula for this, right? So there's always that kind of, it has to be grounded in that kind of, I would say body of knowledge, right? And that's where I think the critical thinking might be a great kind of bridger, but is utilized, I would say, throughout. So maybe a short answer is I don't necessarily see that there's a difference. It's just maybe one particularly thinks of creativity as maybe fluid thinking, but I wouldn't necessarily say that there's no critical thinking within that fluidity.
I'm curious as to whether, Rana, you kind of meant that maybe slightly more in terms of like social intelligence and perhaps to do with other humans, sort of, which is why I see you added that extra bit there, which seems to be on the decline. I love the cynicism.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and thank you for your reply. To me, it's almost like they're used in concert to varying degrees to navigate that process where, creativity, yes, it's very fluid, and critical thinking could be thought of as very rigid. But in one sense, to me, it's the critical thinking that gives us this expansive opportunity, and the critical thinking that actually roots it into fruition. And my thinking is with AI seemingly taking away an aspect of our thought process. And to me, it's yes, on a very basic level it is, but I also feel like it has the power, if we can use it well, to scaffold us to this next level of both creativity and critical thinking. And
I definitely agree with you. I just did the first part of a course earlier today where I was literally talking about this and how just to give you a bit of history, it turns out that part of our brain that has evolved over decades, if not centuries, that's been able to digest large amounts of information, comprehend and elicit the essence of, say, that 400, 500 page book. That part of the brain is actually shrinking due to the latest digital media. Now, that has happened. There's also this thing about, Google searches, are they just, essentially a replacement of our memories? Right. Versus, I don't know, I completely agree with you. Within academia, you're taught to research your sources, primary source, secondary source, all this kind of stuff. Really, you think that? Now, where does that come from? Let's actually, interrogate where that piece of information comes from. And a lot of that leads directly into this whole, debate about fake news and all that kind of stuff anyway, right? So, and the fact that language models do hallucinate. And then we've got now, instead of search engines, we've got answer engines coming to fruition, and they collate. Like, okay, that's nice. I don't have to go searching. But I still want to know that if I click on this reference, it takes me to the right reference, right? And I need to know that I can read that reference and then read the reference that it references and all the rest of it, and really kind of satisfy myself that this is something that is true and as far as anything that can be true, but if there's any sort of consensus on this, or like whether I can satisfy myself that there's some sort of like sense throughout the whole thing, but we do now have a chance at the nascency of this new technology to be more aware of how we're developing it, and the user interaction with it, and is there a way of changing it from that kind of prompt based way of doing things? Is there ways of kind of like what we're doing? Like we're literally sitting there going, how can we augment your creativity? This thing isn't just going to be your sort of facilitator, it's going to provoke you. Haha, what about that? Right. So why not change these kinds of interaction designs, and be like, right, through provocation we can actually stimulate certain different kinds of sparks and different ways of thinking. Okay, great, that's one way of thinking about it. I do think there's something we could do there, like you say, to elevate both ways of thinking there.
It's fascinating because it's for the future of learning, which I'm so interested in as well. I think it's going to to not only improve things, and it's going to make things more available for sure. I think it's already doing that, but it's also going to, once again, just like all of these conversations that we have on Humble Mind, especially about AI in the future, it always somehow comes back to some of the work that we have got to do, certain biases that we've got to first overcome. Never mind what AI or any other technology can do or can't do. It's like, whoa, actually, guys, we're still at the drawing board, with a couple of major things. And we've got to sort those out first. And I think that what you were saying now, if we're getting certain engines or certain co-pilots that are able to provoke us or to kind of throw more things in there and perhaps even challenge us on our knowledge, I don't know how receptive a lot of us are going to end up being to that. Because, for example, when we're in conversation normally, we're not always listening. We're waiting for our chance to talk, and we want to also confirm our own bias. That's what humans do. We always do that. We look for the sources that we want to have, be in concord with what we wanted to agree with what we think already, right? That's confirmation bias, isn't it? So that part is going to be an interesting one to circumnavigate or to evolve through. I'm not sure how that will happen, but yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So it would be interesting to utilize AI to help us overcome our human biases.
Right.
For example, right? And I think, we're doing certain work on that front by utilizing very transparent knowledge graphs, which are within different domains of knowledge and spaces of expertise, let's say, within subject areas and things like that. But I'm sure there's going to be other ways which are much more direct, which show up. Well, this is my personal bias. Okay. How do I do this so that it doesn't totally antagonize me, or actually, helps me kind of bridge that barrier into other ways of thinking or other ways of knowing, maybe. And I think that's something that is kind of largely untapped and a rich area that we can go into.
Yeah. That's fascinating, because when we go into the area of not just information, but how we're essentially feeling, and not to make it a kumbaya moment, but that's essentially what we're after as human beings. We're not necessarily after more knowledge. We want to be able to have a sense of purpose or recognition through a feeling that we get, right? That's why we, perhaps that's something, when we spoke about earlier, when we remember songs, 30 years ago. I can't tell you what I had for breakfast, but I can remember that because there's something there that it registers on an emotional level, and it immediately takes me back to, the feeling I had with my dad, or, walking in the park on a certain day. And so these things are so kind of linked to what seems like some kind of memory center in the brain, which takes me back to a feeling, ultimately, not necessarily information, but an emotional state. And that's interesting.
Yeah. So you kind of talked about, there's also this thing about like changing from information into knowledge, and then from knowledge into wisdom, right? Which is, again, sounds a bit pithy, but that's like very different way of just information, right? By the time you get to wisdom. And I think emotion is definitely one of the bridges. And yet there's some more. There's that kind of ineffable experience of humanness.
Ineffable. Yeah. That's the word. Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask one quick question. I see Rana's put something in there too, but just a last question on flow state specifically, because I know you a lot of your research and your expertise and your time is focused on flow state, understanding and unpacking what it is. Do you have any kind of like sort of easy tips or techniques or little tricks that can allow someone to sort of discover because it's also a very individual experience for each person,
Yeah.
right? Some people, for example, love taking their laptop and getting a whole lot of work done in a busy, noisy cafe because it helps them concentrate. I'm actually like that. Whereas it needs to be complete silence for other people. And so you're able to enter these states of the brain which help to unlock a sense of productivity or happiness for some. Are there certain things that you can kind of do just at a very basic rookie level to help to sort of, okay, how can I find my flow state? Because I think a lot of the time people perhaps mistakenly think that, if it isn't something that pops up really easily, then it's not possible for them to enter flow state. But I'm sure that's not right.
Yeah, I mean, so there's almost two things to look at. One is the personalization that you just said, but also one is the kind of work that you're doing as well. So there's also a difference between getting a lot of work done and being in flow state as well, in the sense that there's being focused and being productive, and then there's being in flow and being productive whilst also really enjoying it. And there's been a transformation of your time, and you come out feeling like you're singing, as we said right at the beginning.
Yeah.
And they're two different mind states, and they're often confused. And so you can drink coffee and get super blinkered and focused, and get your emails done or whatever it is. Sorry, Britishism's blinkered. So you get very what's the word? Tunnel vision. Yeah. That's it. Into the task at hand. But flow states allow you to look at the bigger context and bigger picture at the same time. And so there's an element of flow states happening when you're at a sweet spot of the challenge that you're facing and your ability to meet it. And that's why, the activity that you're doing is really important. So for example, get me to run a marathon, you'd probably find me not getting into flow state for a very long time because I am not a marathon runner. It will take a little bit of time for me to train myself, right? To acquire the skills. First of all, secondly, maybe even the mindset that's associated to running a marathon and all the rest of it, right? Get me to play the piano, I will get into the flow state, probably within the second song, maybe second, who knows? Depends on then my personal, whatever it is in terms of my environment. So I think the activity that you're doing it in makes it one step more complex, right? So for example, if you're doing meditation, the idea is that you actually take a break from the work and then, essentially, you might have these sort of rules to follow in order to maybe check in with yourself and get into mindful space, for example. Flow states are very, I think, related to the task that you're doing. So that's why we're building workflow tools. But if there's some general kind of mechanisms to look at, it's like, can you sort of set yourself tasks that are not too boring, not too difficult, broken down, into doable chunks, but just ever so slightly challenging you, right? And then, you've met the task, great, right? So there's also that kind of measurable milestone there. We've done something, cool, on to the next one, right? So there's that kind of way of keeping you intrinsically motivated and engaged in the whole thing. And then you're talking about your sort of level of skill, and that also comes with your passion. Right. And so again, if I might have a skill, I'm just making this up now. I might have a skill, I don't know, at researching, but do I have a passion for reading through 10 papers on a Monday morning? I don't know. Now, when I really get into my flow state, but I might. But if you give it to me like on a Friday at 5 p.m. on something completely random that I'm really interested in, suddenly, then I'm in 20 papers deep, right? So there's that kind of thing. And then you just talked about what you said about your environment. So A, you found a work thing, whatever that is. B, you've kind of broken it down into achievable, measurable tasks, right? C, do you have a passion in it at that particular point? Yay, right? And then C, do you have any kind of ambient environment around you that is very particular, to you, but also maybe to the kind of work that you're doing. So for example, if I'm doing video editing, I probably don't want anything visual. But if I'm, I don't know, writing my next story, maybe I do want something visual, but maybe I also want something, sonic. But if I'm composing music, I definitely don't want any other songs or, musical interference or, a cafe sound around me, right? So it's also, again, related to the context. So there's that nice sort of interplay between the environment, you personally, the activity you're doing, and your passion for it.
Yeah, no, it's useful to think about it like that. From what I take from what you said is that there's a lot of scope to experiment and to sort of find what works, right? Because I often find, and I know that this is something that a lot of people have, if I'm trying, if I'm trying to force something, force a good idea, force progress, like, I just need to sit here and hammer it all out, it just doesn't come, or it just comes really slowly, which makes the whole process even more agonizing. And so I've got to extract myself from the environment, take a walk, which is always a good idea anyway. And then immediately it all like, oh, where's my laptop now? Like, oh my gosh, it's all returning. Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned that. So in the creative stages that we talk about, there's 4 broad stages: preparation, incubation, insight, and then that's where I think flow comes in. And then there's verification. So that's based on a very old study, nearly 100 years old now, by a guy called Wallace, who basically interviewed hundreds of eminent creatives at the time. It includes musicians as much as it included mathematicians, engineers, and found that people essentially went through these 4 creative stages. Preparation is all about research. Incubation is going for that walk. Insight's that aha moment. Verification is showing everybody. And in performance, it's happening simultaneously, right? But then a few decades later, Csikszentmihalyi, who's the guy who actually came up with flow, started talking about flow as a cool combination of different things, some of which I alluded to, which is, losing track of time, being super engaged, being really cognitively flexible, being able to sort of be in the moment and see the bigger picture at the same time, all that kind of stuff. I think that kicks in your aha moment and you kind of cycle through it. And so, if you're not feeling it, potentially you might be needing to go back to preparation, needing to go back to incubation, and then, jumpstarting yourself, getting back into that kind of flow and insight into play. But it also turns out that if you haven't had a good night's sleep, if you do not feel recovered in the morning, your ability to get in the flow is really hampered, which is quite interesting. I also think that, there's been studies that look at the interrelationship between flow and stress. Hence, I was talking about stress resilience. In some studies, it shows that there's a U-shaped relationship to flow. So, the more stress you give me, the more in flow I get, until there's like a tipping point, and then no, it doesn't work, right? So coming to your question, Rana, there's this kind of sweet spot, right? Which is the difficulty aspect and the challenge. Too much, and no, it's just not going to happen. Too little, still not going to happen, right? Yeah. However, it turns out the more in practice you are of flow, it might actually mean that your threshold of that tipping point goes up. So you're actually more resilient to stress as you go along. So that's where that kind of stress resilience side of things comes from. So, probably you've been under, like, what's the word? High pressure at some point doing something, right? There are moments where you just go, and I can't do this anymore. And then there've been moments where, I thought I couldn't do it anymore, and I can. And then this is even harder, and I can. And this is even harder, and I can, right? And so I think it's one of those kind of practice-based things.
Yeah. I love the way you explain that, and I think it's really useful to think about that U shape. Just because I think often people throw around a word like resilience, and just often I think it, people might just end up understanding that as like, you just got to be tough, you got to be resilient, just clench your teeth and go through it, kind of thing. But rather understanding that really there's an optimal pressure point, where it's not about not having any stress necessarily or no constraints, but some level of, kind of positive pressure, if you want to call it that, so that you do rise to what's needed in that situation. But of course, on the other side of it, not too much, where it all ends up folding in. Yeah, so that's a really good way of seeing it and thinking about it like that.
Yeah, I once had what's the word? let's say, kind of a link between a lesson and a session of acro yoga. It was like my second time ever trying it. And I'm a little bit not so into like heights, to put it mildly. And the teacher was very, very like clear in the way they was like, look, risks are really good. You know, danger is great. However, make sure you do it in safety.
Yeah.
In a sense. Otherwise you're going to traumatize yourself. And next time you're not going to want to try. You know, and if you do try, it's just going to end up in problems again.
Words
Maybe
to
you
live
just
by.
right, you're just going to fall again or whatever it is, and it's just going to reinforce that, right? So it's just like, okay, great, yeah, do the lift, but know how you're doing it.
Yeah.
With all of the right kind of safety measures in place, because then it actually ups your ante in terms of learning something, but also how to do it and keep you cool. You know, so you have that stress, but then your U-shape's just gone up a little, right? Rather than, oh my God.
And so, knowing where that point is for yourself too, right? Because then that turns into a tremendous power that you're able to like sense that moment or sense that point, like, this is where I can perform, this is where I can get the best out of the tools I have, with a certain amount of pressure or a certain amount of factors that I can control, but still are getting the best out of me as well. That's really, really
absolutely
valuable. Shama, it's been a real pleasure to have you on with us and to just to walk around your magnificent brain, as we understand a bit more about our own brains. And it's been fantastic, and we'll definitely be keeping an eye on what you're doing at NeuroCreate, and really hope to have you on again with us in the community on Humble Mind again soon. There's so much to talk about, isn't there?
I'd love to. Let's do a whole session of music. There we go.
Whoa, done. Look up. Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And I'll send out this special code for you all for the network.
Great. We'll put that in the show notes.
Interested.
Yeah.
Okay,
wonderful.
Perfect.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of Humble Mind. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're curious to take a look at our community, if you're not a member, you're missing out. Make sure you head to humblemind.co to check out more and to see what we're up to. I look forward to seeing you there. Until next time.